On the topic of this breakdown of liberalism, you write in Virtue Hoarders, you characterize the period between 1947 and 72 as being an affluent society. And generally, when we look at this history, we're told that neoliberalism started in the 1980s. It was Reagan and Thatcher, the Volcker shock. It happens all of a sudden. And everything before it was placid and going well. What was happening in 1972? Why do you peg it to that period of 45 to 72?
So, a little bit to unpack here. I mean, post World War II, America was a very affluent society compared to the rest of the world, or compared to the rest of the world throughout history. Um, and there were some good things going on at the time. For example, government was a lot smaller back then. So, if you'll look at the pretty chart here produced by the Cato Institute, actually, this is very interesting. You can see that non-defense spending, which is the blue line, was much, much smaller if you look at a percentage of GDP. So the 50s to the 70s, it's increasing. That must be the Great Society. Where's that? Well, anyway, um, the blue line, it's increasing, but it's still less than 10% of GDP. And then you enter the dread era of neoliberalism, where it's pretty much flat at like 13%, little modest decline, and then rapid rise. So overall government spending as a percentage of the economy, a percentage of GDP, was much lower back then, which contributed to economic growth. Less government spending, more private sector investment. Um, and it's also interesting to see that defense spending, U.S. defense spending, has been on a pretty steady decline over the years, again, as a percentage of GDP. But so the 50s to the 70s, not only was there substantially smaller government, it was also much less oriented towards welfare or towards domestic spending, and it was more of a night watchman state where the focus was on military spending. But the other thing is that compared to today, living standards back then were quite lousy. Still, what's important is the rate of growth more than absolute standards. Okay, so here's a graph of GDP growth from 1930 to 2022. Now, it's important to take this with a grain of salt. GDP growth does not necessarily mean economic growth. There is correlation, but it's certainly not a one-to-one ratio. GDP can go up when the government institutes bad policies and can go down when the government institutes good policies. What GDP measures is the amount of spending in the economy. That's why it's a pretty good crude measure, because rich countries can spend a lot more than poor countries. But you shouldn't make the mistake that GDP go up means economy goes up. That's not necessarily the case. For example, if the government bought $1 trillion worth of cars and drove them into the ocean, that would make GDP go up, especially like if they printed the money to do it. That would inflate the GDP statistic, but at the same time cause a great deal of suffering, and it would completely destroy the economy, or at least be a massive economic setback. But putting that aside, then, it does look like economic growth was better, or the GDP figure was going up faster during the post World War II period. Like, if you compare, this section here after World War II, the peaks are a little higher. You got 8%, 7%, 7%, 6%, 6%. And here, I mean, 7%, 4%, 5%, 4%. So the peaks are a little higher, and you can see that it doesn't spend more time below the zero line. In fact, it starts spending more time here in this later section. Are the ups and downs more frequent? Like, presumably, you could take total area above the 0% line and get some sort of summation. Um, it does it does look like there was more growth during the 50s to the 70s than like after that, but not really to an extreme degree. And given the inadequacies of the GDP statistic, I don't think you can tell that much from this graph. Um, so I'm going to go back with my earlier point, which was less government, so more economic growth. Maybe the money was a little sounder, although even though the U.S. didn't technically go off the gold standard until Nixon, it was very much a de facto paper money system at this point. So what's going on here? There's a little romanticization of the past, and people like to blame Reagan and neoliberalism for the decline of America, even when that's not really substantiated. Uh, Within the context of 20th century American economic history, I think we can conclude that the economy was growing throughout the 20th century, throughout the post World War II era, maybe a little faster during the like 40s to the 70s, and then, um, but for the most part, pretty much the same. Okay, the next claim that Catherine Liu makes is, well, it's a little silly.
And what started the breakdown?
I think the 70s we still had the afterglow, but 72 is the year in economic production, and I got this from Jim English's book on prestige, when the weight of American goods that were produced in America began to decrease, which means
The
it's
physical
the
weight.
physical weight of
Wow.
things.
Ah, yes, the great decline in American economic history when they started producing lighter goods.
A series of economic policies that were meant to discipline the working class. Among them, the subsidization and the promotion of industrialization of South Korea and Taiwan.
So during the 50s to 70s, if you look at the exports as a share of GDP, you see it's pretty stable at about 5%. So during the 70s, what changed was America started exporting a lot more goods. And the same phenomena occurred with imports. So imports were about 5% of the American economy or of GDP, leading up to the 70s, from the 30s to the 70s, actually um, falling quite a lot during World War II, because everybody's producing their own stuff, they want to trade or whatever. And then, during the 50s to the 70s, sort of flat at 4%, and then a dramatic increase um, in the 70s and 80s. So, as a share of the total economy, both the imports and the exports increased substantially during the time period they're talking about. Um, I don't have any information about the weight of the goods being traded. I can't possibly see how that would have any relevance. But basically, what happened during this time period was the US started doing more international trade. And I don't see how that would lead to the decline of America their argument is, I guess, heavy industry was offshored. Um, However, I maintain, as per the previous graph of GDP growth, that there was no real decline, or maybe there was a modest decline. Nothing really noticeable. Growth rates have been similar in the post World War II era. And to the degree that economic growth has slowed down, it's been because of the growth of government, not because the shrinking weight of what America is manufacturing and exporting.
Export its jobs.
I don't know if this bears out now, but we would often hear that bringing manufacturing somewhere else was going to make those goods cheaper. Americans would then be able to purchase those things at a lower price, and thus their quality of life would increase. Has that seemed to work out? Do you think, was that ever true, or was that just a piece of propaganda?
In my generation, like I can still remember when wages were high and things were more expensive. And, the kind of Walmart Target explosion happened like kind of when I was a young adult already. And it was just a shittier world. We had cheaper things, but wages were lower. So life did not get better. It all has to do with the compression of wages.
Mm.
And the compression of wages, accompanied with the cheaper goods introduced from China, doesn't produce a place where average Americans can live without going into enormous amounts of debt.
You can see she's sort of a little confused because she has no idea what she's talking about. But that's just completely wrong. Uh, Wages have increased, standards of living have increased. Basically, this phenomenon that she's discussing just never happened. And this is a common trend among leftists. They just live in this alternate reality that's not based on data or facts, or it's pure feels, and it's like a shared reality. They all believe that this is happening, that there's a decline, and it's just completely disproven by objective data. Like stuff back in the 50s and the 60s. I'm not sure precisely what she's talking about. She says my generation. She doesn't give the years, but they're talking about how the 50s and 70s were better. 50s and 60s to the 70s were better, and then neoliberalism destroyed everything. Blah 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 blah. Blah. But uh, the thing is, like, stuff back then sucked. Okay, like the houses were like trailer parks. They're just low quality, not very big. Now we've got computers and TVs that are light years ahead. We've got these phones that are light years ahead. Our standards of living today are so much better than they were back then because we've had so many decades of economic progress. It could have been even better if we had stuck with the whole laissez-faire playbook and had the economic growth that you saw in 19th century America, especially late 19th century America. Like in the 1920s, the economy was growing at like 4 or 5% every year, very stable, just like upwards trajectory. And I know there was the 29 crash and subsequent depression, but well, let's not get into it right now. But that was basically all the fault of Hoover and FDR, or what they did in the wake of the recession. Um, there's so many things that people take for granted today, like automatic dishwashers and automatic laundry machines, that weren't necessarily commonplace in the past. Even indoor plumbing was not ubiquitous. In the 1950s, like one third of homes did not have full indoor plumbing. And in the 1960s, a lot of people were still using outhouses, especially in the more rural areas. Here's the US Census data. So 1950, lacking complete plumbing, 15 million, 35% of US households. By 1970, that's dropped dramatically to 7%. Maybe there's a grain of truth in this whole line of thought. I mean, mostly what she's saying is pretty crazy, but maybe there's a grain of truth in that uh, the deindustrialization of the American economy or the offsourcing of industry, uh, maybe that has been somewhat negative. And a big part of the problem is all of the barriers to the market economy functioning imposed by the state. So right now you have a massive global population of poor people and like billions of desperately poor people, that would love to be hard workers earning even a modest wage in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and Africa, and around the world. So, like in the absence of government restrictions on the labor market, on immigration, all these things, what would probably happen is you would have um, like the import of all these potential workers, and they would work for comparatively low wages in the United States, like $4 an hour, for example. Just throwing a number up out there. This is all conjecture, but you could bring all those potential foreign workers together and have massive industrial expansion in the United States. Um, but all of that is illegal under the present system because of the various laws concerning the labor market and immigration. So if you had a free market, there probably would be a lot more industrial activity in the American economy. They wouldn't offshore the jobs, they would onshore the people. And this would probably be a great thing for consumers, certainly for those workers who no longer have to languish in poverty, but also for consumers who can enjoy the less expensive manufactured goods. It would create a lot of jobs, not just the workers, but then all the associated jobs, higher paying jobs like management and logistics and what have you. Well, the market always finds a way, even in the wake of these restrictions. Uh, I guess the best solution is the offshoring of the low skilled work, industrial work. But back to what you were saying about the compression of wages and how there's this conscious policy by the capitalist elites to discipline the working class. Um, well, this post here in Ask Economics really addresses the difference between the modern standard of living and that of the 1950s. They want to live in larger homes now, more appliances and electronics, better furniture. So basically, standards of living are way up today because we've had 7 decades of economic growth, enabling workers to be more productive and to receive higher salaries. Uh, Basically, it's just a myth that things were better back then, at least in an absolute sense. Maybe the economy grew a little faster then uh, because there was less government, because the market economy wasn't as fettered, but there really hasn't been a sea change with regards to uh, economic growth or how the economy's been changing or doing. One one final metric is U.S. average hours worked per week. This is the wrong one. Anyway, here's Google search for that. So basically, you can show this is the one here uh, from the Federal Reserve, St. Louis, and shows average annual hours worked by persons engaged for the United States. Uh, so showing about 200 hours worked less in now. than in the 1950s. So not only have wages increased, standards of living increased steadily, but hours worked has also decreased. So people have more free time, more paid time off. All right, that seems like a good place to leave it, but I just wanted to address that claim because you see it all the time and it's not true. So wanted to get some data and facts and disprove this whole narrative, which is nonsense. The left live in a fantasy world.